So we've talked about America's founding from its first colony in Virginia, expanding onto the 13 colonies, leading up to the American Revolution against Britain. So now America is recognized as its own country, its own independence. Okay. So we have the Declaration of Independence now and our own Constitution. So now America is ready to grow and expand and acquire new states and territories. So this leads us up to the Louisiana Purchase and just acquiring different and new states, expanding westward, which really triggers the idea of manifest destiny, where it's like, okay, America has this God-given will to expand west, okay? So now this leads us up to the Mexican and American War, where America wants these territories that Mexico owns, which is like and California, Texas, and Arizona. So at first, America tried to buy these territories, but Mexico didn't want to sell these territories. So that's what triggered the Mexican and American War. So ultimately, America wins this war and acquires these new states of California and New Mexico. So now you have these new states, but you also have different ideas, because in the North, you have this Industrial Revolution, which leads us to the telegraph and the railroads. So really this industrializes the North, and it gives them an advantage in economy to where they have these factories, they're able to produce different textiles, and it kind of gives them a leverage to where they don't have to rely on slavery. But the South is still they're more hell-bent on relying on their slaves and their classic plantations and their way of living. So you have these separation of ideas and way of life in the North, in the South. And that's where you get the Union in the North and the Confederates in the South. So this leads us up to the election of the 1860, where Abraham Lincoln is now elected as president as a Republican. He takes advantage of this divided Democratic Party at the time, and he's able to capitalize on this and become president of the Union. So the Union is really recognized as America, the federal America. So the Confederate States are really, they succeeded away from the Union. And Abraham Lincoln was not recognized them as, their own official country. So this leads up to many tensions. You have the ideas of slavery, you have these abolitionists, you have these new states, and they're wondering what they're going to do. So there's a lot going on, the Mason-Dixon line. What are these states going to do? What is the future of America? So ultimately, this leads up to the Civil War. So after Abraham Lincoln was elected, this really triggered the South. So deciding on what's the future of America, and ultimately, this leads to the Battle of Fort Sumter, which really, at least from what I see, there weren't any deaths in this battle, but it was a siege and there was cannon fire attacking this fort at Fort Sumter, where these Union troops were placed at. So this is really the first conflict that started the war, this American Civil War. So ultimately, this barrage of cannon fire, it whittles the Union troops figured that they couldn't hold that position forever. So they ultimately end up surrendering to this Confederate army. So this is what starts the Civil War. Okay. So now there's a push for militias throughout these states, because at this time, there wasn't just this big federal army already in the North or the South. So really, they were big on militias. So each state basically had their own individual armies, or basically they had these farmers, and they basically would, grab their gun from the fireplace, and now they're in the militia. So really, it was more about state to state right now. Okay. So after Fort Sumter, this leads up to the Battle of Bull Run, which is also called the Battle of Manassas. And really, Abraham Lincoln and the North, the Union, going into this battle, they're thinking, okay, this is gonna be a quick war. It's gonna be a quick civil war. Okay, that's what they're thinking against the South. We're gonna get together, rally these troops, and we're just gonna teach them a lesson straight up, off the bat. Okay, so this leads us up to the Battle of Bull Run and Manassas. And, it's a pretty interesting battle to where it's close to Washington, D.C. So you have these governors come out to watch the war. You have these families come out and set up picnics, in the hills around the war. So people are literally coming out to watch this war happen. And ultimately, at first, the Union is winning this battle against these Confederate troops under Robert E. Lee. But after, now we have the invention of, technology, of railroads. So towards the end of the day, Robert E. Lee gets these reinforcements from these trains. So now, after getting these reinforcements, the Confederates start kicking tail. And now you have a situation where these Union forces under Ulysses Grant are forced to retreat. So now Abraham Lincoln goes from early in the day, he's pretty excited, it's going to be a quick victory, to now, after seeing his troops retreat, now he's like, wow, this is going to be a pretty long war. So now this goes from, this is going to be a quick war, let's get this message through, to, wow, this is going to be a brutal, bitter war. So this Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. And there were many, many, many battles over the course of these 4 years. And it was bloody. Okay, you have thousands of troops dying, brother against brother, cousins against cousins, uncle against uncle. Okay, it's really crazy. You also have these Native American troops that fight on both sides. But, interesting fact is that a lot of these Native Americans owned slaves as well. So a lot of these Native Americans fought on the side of the Confederates. There were natives that fought on both sides, but there were some as well that fought on the sides of the Confederates, to keep their way of life and to keep their slaves as well. And also, these natives were mad at the Union after the Trail of Tears, which led them to the territories of Oklahoma. So after that, they had their reasons to either be mad at the Union in the North, or, be indifferent, or, like I said, this is brother against brother. So there's many ideologies on both sides. Okay. So now we have the Battle of Bull Run, and this leads us to the Battle of Antietam. So now we have Robert E. Lee against Ulysses Grant in a Battle of Antietam facing off. But ultimately, these Confederate soldiers win. And this is considered one of the bloodiest battles in the history of America. Like, actually, not only on American soil, but it's in history of all American wars, period, leading up to the War of Vietnam. So this is just one of the biggest, bloodiest battles. Okay, you have the North against the South. These are, Robert E. Lee, he was actually he was a great general. Okay, he was a very great general. So now you have Robert E. Lee. Oh, and also Stonewall Jackson as well. And at this battle of Antietam, Thomas Stonewall Jackson. So at this battle of Antietam, he gets his name because Stonewall Jackson, he's on his horse leading his men in battle to victory. And it said he was like a stone wall leading his men in battle. So that's how you get the story of Stonewall Jackson and how he gets his name in the Confederate Army. Okay, so now that's the Battle of Antietam. And over these next years, there's still many, countless bloody battles throughout these territories, throughout these farms, towns, and cities going on. So now we fast forward from 1861 to 1863. And this leads us up to the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay. So before the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, there's been many battles going on, okay? From the Battle of Atrium all the way to the Battle of Chancellor Hill. And even in Chancellor Hill, that ends up being a major defeat for the Union Army. So Robert E. Lee he's tearing the Union Army up, okay? There's wins and losses on both sides, but at the same time, Abraham Lincoln understands he's been taking these losses. So Abraham Lincoln, he basically he realizes he needs all the help he can get militarily and politically. So, and in the beginning of 1863, January 1st, Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And this basically says that all of the enslaved people are now free. So this is very big in Black history, African history. This is very big for world history right here. All the slaves are now free. And this is really emphasized on these Confederate states, especially these plantation owners who still own slaves. So this really triggers. So now that he's saying that they're free, these slaves are still technically under the jurisdiction of their masters. But with this Emancipation Proclamation, these slaves are more incentivized to run away to the North. Now they're more incentivized to run away to the North and join the Union Army to fight for their freedom. So I know, of course, this had triggered the South, this Emancipation Proclamation, but it was a beautiful thing for Black people and Black history. So not only does this strengthen Abraham Lincoln's armies, but also politically, especially in the eyes of Black people, because now not only are the slaves coming to join him, but also this incentivized the Blacks that are already free to join him as well to support the cause. Okay, so now it's a political boost for the Union Army and also a military boost for the army. So now you have a situation where he's, throughout these drafts and raising of militias, they also now have the support of Black people in their armies. So now this leads us up to the Battle of Gettysburg later on in the year of 1863. So now you have a situation where there's more African troops supporting these armies. Okay. So in the Battle of in the Battle of Chancellor Hill, General George McClellan of the Union Army, he takes his defeat from Robert Lee. and Stonewall Jackson. Okay, but so Abraham Lincoln, he's not really pleased with George McClellan at this moment. And he basically, before the Battle of Gettysburg, he replaces George McClellan with George Meade, General George Meade. Okay, so now Meade takes over of this Union Army. And in the South, though it was a victory for this Confederate Army, they lose a little bit after that battle. They lose they use Stonewall Jackson, I'm sorry. So now you have a situation where Robert E. Lee loses his favorite general, Stonewall Jackson. It said that he fell under friendly fire or some type of situation like that. So it was an unfortunate loss for this Confederate Army that they lose one of their top generals. So now you have a situation where Robert E. Lee, you know, though he's been getting these victories, he is this great general, that he really wants to make a push now. He really, you know, both sides, from Abraham Lincoln to Robert E. Lee, they didn't really want this extended war. You know, you have brother against brother in this situation. So, but especially now, Robert E. Lee wants to push, and, you know, his idea is, you know, let's put some pressure towards Washington, D.C. Let's be aggressive now. Let's push some pressures so that, you know, or you also have the election coming up in 1864 now. That's coming up. So this is just an interesting situation where you have this big major civil war going on, but also you have this election coming up. So the military victories are just as important as the political victories. So Robert E. Lee wants to just make a statement here. So he makes an aggressive push up north, and this leads us to the Battle of Gettysburg, which is close to Washington, D.C. on the top border. So ultimately, the Union soldiers stop. They're like, okay, this is where the battle's going to be. We can't let them progress further than this. So this leads us up to the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So now General Robert E. Lee is making his aggressive push to make this statement. Okay. So at the same time, you have this Union Army under now General George Meade making this defensive stand, okay, in this Gettysburg. And he decides to take the high ground to give them as much advantage as they could get. So this high ground, you have Cope's Hill, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, down to Little Round Top and Round Top. So Round Top is a bigger hill, then you have Little Round Top, and then the Ridge and these other hills. So this is a 3-day battle that goes on in Gettysburg. So the first day, you have many clashes of carbine rifles and revolvers against each other. You also have these cannons firing at each other, these artillery firing at each other. And Robert E. Lee, he takes a strategy of, he wants to face the Union Army, I'll just say pretty much head on to make his statement. Okay, so he wants to face them head on, but at the same time, he decides to attack them at Cope's Hill on their top left flank. Okay, in this first day of battle. But ultimately, it results into a stalemate on the first day of battle. There was no successive breakthrough in the defensive lines. Okay, so now this leads us up to day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg. And now you have General Lee take this approach. He's like, okay, so that didn't work. So he's like, okay, now let me take Little Round Top then. Let's try that approach. Let's try the other flank. Okay. So now he goes for this other flank. Okay. So you have Robert E. Lee and his Army of Virginia facing off against Joshua Chamberlain and his Army of Maine. And just imagine these carbine rifles and these revolvers and cavalry facing against each other. Meanwhile, you have these cannons, these artillery cannons blasting off at each other. So just missiles coming in. So you just have the situation going on where both sides are trying to gain leverage. And like I said, this is brother against brother. You know, these people have fought with each other in the Mexican-American War, some of them. And now they're fighting against each other in the Civil War. So you have these carbine rifles just shooting each other. And ultimately, Robert E. Lee, he starts to gain a little bit of leverage in the situation and taking Little Round Top. So Joshua Chamberlain, I say might be getting a little bit nervous, okay? Because now you have a situation where Robert E. Lee, he's starting to flank on the right side of General Chamberlain, Mr. Chamberlain, okay? So as a result of that, Joshua Chamberlain, he makes pretty much a L shape of his troops, because he knows that if he gets flanked, pretty much this will result in them losing the whole battle. So Joshua Chamberlain does not want to get outflanked at all costs. You know, there's pressures on his top flank, and now there's pressures on his bottom flank, which results in him and his troops making a pretty much of an angled L shape to defend their flank in the front lines against Robert E. Lee. So you have a situation where, you know, these carbine rifles are firing off at each other. You know, he's trying to not make sure his flanks aren't getting exposed. But Robert E. Lee, being his great general, he keeps pressing forward and pressing forward. And now Joshua Chamberlain and his main troops, they're starting to take many hits. They're starting to take many losses now. So now Joshua Chamberlain, he's like, what am I going to do? I'm taking these losses. He's like, I can't lose this hill. I cannot. So Joshua Chamberlain, he basically makes a decision to make a charge against Robert E. Lee and his troops. So during this charge, basically, Joshua Chamberlain, he orders his left flank. He's like, I want you guys to put on your bayonets on your guns and make basically a curved charge at the enemy. And when you guys do that, you know, basically Joshua Chamberlain's like, you know, we're going to lead our charge directly at them. Okay. So basically Joshua Chamberlain has fired the bullets and fire is going on all around him. You know, he looks to his left flank and he's like, bayonets. He's like, ready. He's like, charge. And then you hear the sound of the bugles blowing. Dun, 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 dun. And now he prepares for the charge. Bayonets, charge. So now you have these Union troops with their bayonets on their guns, leading a melee charge downhill against Robert E. Lee and his Confederate troops of Virginia. So he leads his charge, and ultimately this charge is victorious. This charge breaks through. And as Joshua Chamberlain gets to the bottom of this hill, you have this Confederate officer, and he raises his gun to shoot Joshua Chamberlain. And the gun misfires. Joshua Chamberlain looks at this Confederate troop officer, and he's like, "We're taking you captive. You're under arrest." And Chamberlain moves on and finishes off this charge of bayonets. And the Union troops take this prisoner captive. And so basically, day 2 of this battle is now, in a sense, of victory for these Union troops. So now, this leads us to day 3 of the Battle of Gettysburg. And now Robert E. Lee is forced to make a decision. He does not want to, he's extended pretty far up north away from his capital. And, he understands that he needs a victory here, basically, to win the war. It's almost, I don't want to say an all or nothing situation, but he does not want to go back home losing this battle with everything on the line. So this leads us up to the famous or infamous picket charge of Robert E. Lee, where he decides to, first he tried the top left flank, right flank, and then he tried the bottom left flank. So now he decides on the picket charge, which is more of a direct assault against this hill, okay, against Cemetery Hill, okay. So now he just comes to this point where the die is cast. So now he's leading thousands and thousands of Confederate troops against these Union army under General George Meade. And just picture the cannons, the cavalry and their sabers slashing each other. Picture the carbine rifles and repeater rifles firing at each other in this basically desperate charge, this picket charge uphill at the battles of Gettysburg. And, at first, this battle is just ensuing. It's ensuing. Nobody's really making a breakthrough. But ultimately, General Meade, he decides to concentrate his forces, and then he leads his own charge. And ultimately, this charge breaks through the Confederate lines. And General Lee is forced to retreat back to the South. So the Battle of Gettysburg ultimately resulted in a victory militarily and politically for the Union Army. And so this was 1863. The war really wasn't over until 1865. And there were many battles that happened after this war and after this battle in 1863. But this was really a decisive moment for the Union Army, okay? And for Abraham Lincoln. And at the same time that this battle was going on at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, you had the top general, Ulysses S. Grant, down in Mississippi at the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi. So that was another reason why General Robert Lee was so aggressive, because he's like, your best general is down here in Mississippi. So he's like, let me take George Meade out, okay? But it still resulted in a victory for General George Meade and the Union Army under Abraham Lincoln. So, and the day after this battle, so that was July 3rd, on the 3rd day of battle. So on the 4th of July, that's when you have Ulysses S. Grant ultimately become victorious in his siege down in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So really, this is a double win for the Union Army, militarily and politically, because with the siege of Vicksburg, they've already, took the Navy route away from the Confederate Army to where they couldn't really trade resources with other countries. So after the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, now the Confederates couldn't trade their resources even up the Mississippi River. So now, it's more of a war of attrition, to where the Confederate Army was really limited now, especially after the siege of Vicksburg. That cut them off from the Texas territories. And it also limited their trade, stifled their trade. So now this is a major win, especially when it comes to the election of 1864 for Abraham Lincoln. So after winning this Battle of Gettysburg, this leads to Abraham Lincoln's famous address and speech at Gettysburg, where he says, "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers came to this continent and conceived of this country, a place where all men are created equal." He said something like that. So basically, Abraham Lincoln had took this as a military victory and a political victory, and he ultimately ended up winning the election of 1864. So after the Battle of Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg, it was a double victory. Also with the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, that's another victory, a political victory. So now it's a situation where the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee is very stifled, and now that Robert E. Lee is forced into a defensive position. So after Gettysburg, never again did the Confederate Army come back again into the North. After that, it was really a defensive war and battles for the Confederate Army. So finally in 1865, after thousands and thousands of deaths throughout this terrible civil war, brother against brother, so much bloodshed and atrocities, it leads us to the Battle of the Appomattox Courthouse. And finally, you have General Ulysses S. Grant closing in on General Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee, ultimately, he realizes that he's surrounded, he's cut off from his remaining troops, and on this day, he surrenders. So he ends up surrendering in 1865, and this brings an end to the war. So, the Civil War, and after that, in 1865, you also get the 13th Amendment written into the Constitution. So at first in 1863, it was the Emancipation Proclamation, and then you get the 13th Amendment, which freed all the slaves actually in the Constitution, constitutionally. Okay. So it's not just this Emancipation Proclamation. Now this is actually federal law under now United States of America again. So now this is where you get the flag with the 36 stars, incorporating now I believe it's Arizona and the new states now. So now America is back unified again after the Civil War, and now the slaves are actually finally freed. Okay, so now you have a situation where, the slaves are freed. But another thing is that Abraham Lincoln, something like on the eve of battle, Abraham Lincoln ends up getting assassinated at this theater. Okay, now he gets assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at this theater. I guess he was some Confederate sympathizer, that he obviously didn't agree with Abraham Lincoln, but that's where you get the infamous assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And then, so after Abraham Lincoln's assassinated, that's when you get Andrew Jackson, which was his vice president. Now he becomes the 17th president of the United States of America. So though this resulted in a victory for the Union, we did lose Abraham Lincoln. And, there's just a lot going on in the nation. You have these freed slaves, but you still have a very, very racist country. You still have these Confederates that still, are trying to hold on to their old ways of life. So the political landscape of America, there's hope, but there's still a lot of hate going on at the same time. So this leads us up to the point of Reconstruction, where, we're supposed to be building this new nation. We're supposed to be empowering these now freed slaves to be able to get jobs and get land and farms. But at the same time you get Reconstruction, you also get the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, trying to combat that. So you can see how this political landscape of America is very, very, very tumultuous. And so when you have, these newly freed slaves, a victory for the Union, and also, Reconstruction and the founding of the KKK, these situations and dynamics is what ultimately leads up to the civil rights movement 100 years later, where the slaves that were meant to be free are finally freed 100 years later in the civil rights movement. So we've gone over the founding of the first 13 colonies, all the way up to the first American, the American Civil War, and really, and then that leads us up to the age of Reconstruction and just the formation of the 50 states of America that we know today. So there were many Blacks and Africans that fought in this war, like William Matthews, and also Peter, from the movie Emancipation with Will Smith. So, you have Peter that, though his back was strapped up with lashes of whippings from slavery, he was one of the heroes of the Civil War as well. So these African Americans have many parts and roles throughout this whole Civil War. And, from what I hear, was when it's time for the brothers to pick up a gun and shoot, they handle business. That's all I was hearing. So, shout out to Abraham Lincoln. Shout out to both sides. So overall, it's said to be about 700,000 deaths. I've heard 800,000, 650,000, 700,000 deaths. So ultimately, it was the most deaths. It was basically the most bloodshed that Americans have shed all the way up until the Vietnam War. So after the final surrender of Robert E. Lee, and along with the rest of the Confederate troops, it's said that Joshua Chamberlain had basically watched over this actual surrender and this, this processional line where the troops, Confederate troops, had came and, turned in their guns. And So basically, Joshua Chamberlain had called for all his, all his people to salute these Confederate soldiers that they had just fought against, towards the end of the war. So that was pretty interesting. And actually, after the end of the war, Robert E. Lee he ended up becoming a president of Lexington College. So I guess he still, lived on after the war. And even up into modern days, the Confederate fighting spirit still lives on, as you can see in the Capitol riots, and, they still waving these flags around. So go ahead, Confederates.